There was a moment in American history when a gas station wasn't a place you went to buy fuel. It was a place where someone looked you in the eye, knew your name, and remembered what kind of oil your Chevrolet preferred. That person, the station owner or the attendant, made money not because they sold gasoline, they made money because they were trusted. And in the mid-20th century, that trust was worth something concrete. It was worth a margin. It was worth customer loyalty. It was worth survival. Today, when you pull up to a gas pump, you're often not even sure if anyone works there at all. The station is a machine. The fuel is a commodity, and the owner, if there even is a traditional owner anymore, makes almost nothing from what they're actually selling. But here's what the conventional story gets wrong. Gas stations didn't stop making money because gasoline became cheaper or because people bought less fuel. They stopped making money because the entire economic structure beneath them transformed. And that transformation began not at the pump, but in a room full of people asking a very different question: what if we could eliminate the person entirely? For decades, the gas station owner's real profit center wasn't fuel margins, which were always thin. It was the relationship. The customer came for gasoline, yes, but stayed for the oil changes, the tire repairs, the air in your tires, the batteries, the belts. The owner employed a mechanic. Sometimes two. They knew how to keep a car alive. That knowledge commanded a price. That knowledge was a moat. The fuel was just the draw, the bait. When you look at the financials of a 1960s independent gas station owner, the breakdown is almost shocking to modern eyes. Fuel sales might account for only 30 to 40% of total revenue. The rest came from services, from repairs, from the small margin on parts, from trust. A station with 4 pumps, doing maybe 3,000 gallons a week at a dime per gallon margin, was generating $300 a week on fuel alone. In 1965, that's real money, but the same station doing tune-ups at $15 each, selling batteries at a 30% markup, performing oil changes and tire rotations, that was generating $2,000 a week, sometimes more. That's where the owner lived. The station owner wasn't a fuel distributor. He was a service operator. He was an employer. He had overhead, the garage, the tools, the lift, the compressor, the inventory of parts. He had payroll, but he had pricing power because his customers had no other choice. They knew him. They trusted him. In a small town, there might be only 1 or 2 stations within 10 miles. That was the actual business model. Then something changed, and it happened gradually enough that most people didn't notice it was happening at all. The first crack came in the late 1960s, when large oil companies began to realize something crucial. They didn't need to share the retail margin with independent owners. If they could build their own stations, control the real estate, set the prices, they could capture everything. The fuel margin plus the service margin, all of it. The big oil companies started building company-operated stations at scale. They were willing to operate on thinner margins because they owned the entire value chain. They controlled the supply, the distribution, the retail outlet, and increasingly the services inside it. But here's where the conventional story usually stops. It says the oil companies squeezed out the independents. The end. That's not what happened. That's just the beginning of what happened. Around the same time, the late 1960s and early 1970s, something else was occurring. The convenience store was being invented, or rather it was being perfected, and the convenience store had a secret advantage that no one initially understood. It didn't need to employ a mechanic. The convenience store model was pure margin extraction from low-labor operations. You didn't need someone with certification. You didn't need someone with knowledge. You needed someone to be present during hours when customers might stop by. You needed a register and a manager. That was fundamentally cheaper than employing a trained mechanic. And so, very quietly, the gas station began to split into 2 businesses. On one side, the oil companies perfected the fuel and basic convenience model. On the other side, the mechanic and the service bay gradually vanished, not because customers didn't need those services anymore, but because the economics of the gas station itself no longer supported them. Here's the economics that matters. In the 1960s, a station owner might operate with these rough margins. Fuel at 8 to 10 cents per gallon. Services at 25 to 30% markup. Convenience items, if they even stock them, at 15 to 20%. But the convenience store revolution changed the calculus completely. If you could stock your station with the same convenience items that a dedicated convenience store stocked, suddenly you could capture that 15 to 20% margin on a much higher volume of transactions. Not everyone needed an oil change, but almost everyone bought a drink, a snack, a pack of cigarettes, a coffee. The problem was that scaling the convenience business required something the service business never did: massive real estate, premium locations, and absolute uniformity of operations. You couldn't have a small local station anymore. You had to be big enough to negotiate with suppliers at volume, you had to be in high-traffic areas, you had to look exactly like every other station, and that meant you had to eliminate the people who couldn't be standardized. The mechanic with the special knowledge, the owner who did his own work, the local presence that was irreducible and unique. The shift happened across the 1970s and 1980s. By the end of the 1980s, the majority of new gas stations being built had no service bays at all. They were convenience stores with pumps attached. The economics were completely inverted. But, and this is crucial, the inverted economics didn't just eliminate the mechanic, they eliminated the profit itself. Here's why. The convenience store margin, while higher as a percentage, operated on much thinner absolute profits because of the operational complexity. You needed inventory management, you needed multiple suppliers, you needed constant restocking, you had far higher shrinkage, people stealing drinks and snacks is a real line item, you needed more employees, you needed management systems. The service business was simple. A customer came in, you diagnosed their car, you ordered the part or had it in stock, you performed the service, you charged them, the margin was clear, the transaction was discrete. The convenience business was a machine that required constant feeding. In 1975, a gas station owner in Ohio could reasonably expect to clear $3,000 to $4,000 per month from a station doing perhaps $50,000 in annual revenue. His major expenses were fuel cost, payroll for 1 or 2 employees, rent on the building and the land, utilities, and insurance. His actual labor input might be 40 to 50 hours per week. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a solid middle-class income. It was enough to own your station outright, often by the time you'd been operating for 5 or 10 years. By 1995, that same real estate location, now configured as a convenience store with pumps, might do $200,000 in annual revenue, but the owner's take-home might be $2,000 per month, actually less in real terms. Why? Because the economics had shifted so thoroughly that most of that $200,000 in gross revenue was flowing directly to suppliers. The convenience store business is a volume business. The volume creates the illusion of health, but the actual profit margin is so thin that only true scale, meaning major corporate chains, can make it work. The independent gas station owner didn't lose his business because gasoline prices changed or because customers preferred self-service. He lost his business because the fundamental value proposition of the location, the trusted mechanic, the local service provider, the person who knew your car, became economically incompatible with the new model. You couldn't be a small profitable station anymore because the new competitive environment required scale, and you couldn't achieve scale without abandoning the thing that made you profitable in the first place. This is the paradox that killed the independent gas station. Not competition, not price, but the replacement of a high-margin, low-volume, knowledge-intensive business with a low-margin, high-volume, capital-intensive business. And the true tragedy is that almost no one consciously decided this. It emerged from thousands of individual decisions, oil companies calculating that company-operated stations could undercut independence, convenience store operators realizing they could put their model everywhere, customers choosing the familiar corporate brand over the local owner, lending institutions refusing to finance the old model anymore because the numbers no longer worked. By the early 2000s, the independent gas station was essentially extinct in most of America. Not because of oil company conspiracy, though consolidation certainly happened. Not because of price wars, though those happened too, but because the business itself had been fundamentally restructured in a way that made the old model impossible to execute profitably. The gas station owner of 2024 doesn't lose money because of thin fuel margins. That's true, but it misses the point. He loses money because the entire underlying value creation model was dismantled and replaced with something that only works at corporate scale. And the most bitter irony? The modern gas station with convenience store often has thin margins in those convenience items too. The market got so competitive, so saturated, that the margin advantage the convenience store model once had simply evaporated. The person behind the register today is not an owner with skin in the game, he's an employee earning minimum wage. The corporate owner has diversified revenue streams that have nothing to do with the station itself. They own the real estate and lease it to a franchisee. They own the pump hardware and collect fees. They extract margins from the fuel supply chain itself. They've invested in data systems that track customer behavior. The station, in isolation, might be barely profitable or even unprofitable, but it serves other purposes in the larger system. This transformation didn't happen because it was inevitable. It happened because it was profitable, for everyone except the people actually operating the station. The customers got cheaper, more convenient access to fuel and snacks. The oil companies captured more of the value chain. The real estate investors profited. The system optimized beautifully for everyone except the person trying to make a living at the actual point of sale. And this is where the story connects to something larger than gas stations. This same transformation happened to other retail models throughout the late 20th century. Department stores, local drug stores, hardware stores, small grocery stores. In almost every case, the pattern was identical. A high-margin, low-volume, knowledge-intensive business got replaced by a low-margin, high-volume, capital-intensive business. The new model was more efficient. The new model was more convenient for customers. The new model extracted more total economic value from the market. But it extracted that value in a way that made it nearly impossible for the small operator, the owner with skin in the game, to survive. What most people miss when they talk about the death of these institutions is that they didn't die because they were less efficient. They died because they were restructured into a form where the people who built them, the people who knew them, could not survive. A gas station owner in 1960 had a business that made sense. The economics worked at human scale. You could own it. You could improve it. You could build equity. You could employ people and pay them well because the margins supported it. A gas station owner in 2010 inherited a business that had been hollowed out by its own success. It was profitable for the system, just not for the person operating it. And this transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened through a series of small, rational economic decisions, each one made by people trying to optimize their own position. The oil companies wanted to reduce their capital exposure. They didn't want to own thousands of stations anymore. It was expensive. It tied up money. It created management overhead. So they pushed toward a franchise model. The station owner became the franchisee. The oil company became the landlord and the supplier. This seemed like a win for the station owner at first. You didn't need as much capital to get started. You didn't have direct employees of the corporation. The risks were distributed. But what actually happened was a slow transfer of all operational risk to the person at the pump. By the early 1980s, the typical gas station franchise agreement had tightened considerably. You had to buy your fuel exclusively from the brand. You couldn't negotiate volume discounts. The company set the wholesale price. You had to maintain specific appearance standards. You had to keep certain hours. You had to provide certain services. In return, you got the brand name and access to their customer base. The economics looked like this. A typical station might pump 3.00 to 4.0000000000 gallons. The wholesale retail spread on gasoline was maybe 4 to 6 cents per gallon. That sounds small, but across high volume it adds up. On 3.500 gallons a day, a 5-cent margin meant $1.75 a day in gross profit, before expenses. But here's where it got tight. The franchise required you to maintain the building. The oil company owned the land typically, or held the lease, and they passed that rent to you. The building needed constant maintenance. Pumps broke down, the roof leaked, asphalt cracked. A complete pump replacement could cost $8 to $1.5000. The oil company didn't cover that, you did. Then there were the labor costs. Even a small station needed at least one attendant at the pumps, someone inside the convenience store portion. By the 1980s, minimum wage was climbing. In California, it was $3.35 per hour. In New York, similar. A single full-time attendant was running you $1.3 to $1.600 a year, plus payroll taxes. Add a part-time evening person and you were at $2.5 to $3.000 annually just for labor. Your daily fuel margin of $1.75 was now looking less impressive when you divided it across the costs of running the operation. And this is where the oil companies made their real move. They realized that the convenience store, the shop inside, was where the actual margin was. Gasoline was a loss leader, a way to get people to stop and buy a soda for $2, a candy bar for $1, a sandwich for $4. The markup on those items was 40 to 60%. The markup on gasoline was 2 to 3%. So the franchise terms began to shift again. Station owners were now required to stock not just snacks and drinks but prepared foods, hot dogs, burritos, pizza, fresh coffee. This required equipment. A roller grill cost $8.00 to $1.500. A commercial coffee maker, another $6.000. A hot case for burritos, another $1.200. The oil company didn't care that you didn't have capital for this. They made it a requirement. And they required you to keep inventory. perishable food. That spoiled if it didn't sell. That tied up cash. That created waste. A station owner in 1960 was running a fuel distribution business. A station owner in 1985 was running a fuel distribution business that also had to operate a restaurant, manage perishable inventory, and deal with all the complexity that brought. The margins didn't expand to match this new responsibility. They actually contracted. By the mid-1980s, the cost structure had become a squeeze. You were buying fuel at wholesale, you were selling it at retail. The spread had tightened because the market was more competitive, more efficient. You had operational costs that kept rising: rent, labor, utilities, insurance. You had capital requirements that kept expanding, new equipment mandated by the oil company, and you had a franchise agreement that locked you into the system and prevented you from ever negotiating better terms. The station owner of 1985 was working harder, managing more complexity, and making less money per gallon sold than the station owner of 1960, but the system was still profitable. For someone, the oil company was thriving. They had removed their capital requirements. They had removed their management burden. They had created a network of franchisees who bore all the operational risk and received the smallest slice of the economic value their business generated. This is the hidden structure that most analyses of the gas station crisis miss. It's not that gas stations became unprofitable. It's that they became unprofitable for the person running them while remaining extremely profitable for the system as a whole. The oil companies were doing what all mature companies eventually do. They were optimizing the system for efficiency, not for the survival of the small operator. And that operator, the person who had imagined they were buying a business, a piece of America they could own and pass down, they were slowly realizing that what they had actually bought was a job, a very demanding job. One that required them to work 70 hours a week to earn what they could have made working 40 hours as a salaried manager somewhere else. This is the economic truth that doesn't appear in the promotional materials or the annual reports. The system was optimized, but it was optimized in a way that extracted value from the operator, not in a way that created value for the operator. And it would only get worse as we moved into the 1990s. By the late 1980s, the independent gas station owner had entered what we might call the phase of structural inevitability. The economics weren't broken, they were functioning exactly as designed, but the design itself had become hostile to the small operator. Let's look at what was actually happening to the independent owner's margin at this point. In 1985, the average independent gas station was operating on a fuel margin of roughly 8 to 10 cents per gallon. This sounds reasonable until you do the math. If you're selling 10,000 gallons a month, which was actually a solid independent station's volume, that's $80,000 to $100,000 in monthly revenue from fuel alone, but that margin translates to only $800 to $1,000 in gross profit before any expenses. Now, subtract your labor costs. A typical independent station in 1987 needed at least 2 full-time employees, plus the owner working the pumps themselves on weekends and evenings. That's 3 or 4 people sharing roughly $3,500 to $4,000 in monthly payroll. You've just consumed 75 to 80% of your fuel profit before you've paid a single other expense. What remained was supposed to cover your rent or mortgage, your utilities, your credit card processing fees, your insurance, your maintenance, and your own living expenses. For many independent owners in 1987 and 1988, this is where the arithmetic became genuinely impossible. The major oil companies, by contrast, were operating on a completely different economic model. A corporate-owned Exxon station, or a Mobil station, didn't need to extract profit from the fuel margin because the corporation owned the refinery that produced the fuel. The station's primary purpose had shifted from being a profitable retail location to being a point of distribution. The profit center wasn't the pump, it was the refinery. The station just needed to move volume. This is a crucial distinction that most people miss when they talk about the decline of the independent gas station. It wasn't primarily about price competition in the brutal sense, it was about 2 completely different business models trying to occupy the same physical space. The independent operator was running a retail business. The major oil company was running a logistics and distribution network. Those are incompatible at the neighborhood level when one of them has access to integrated refinery margins and the other one doesn't. By 1988, independent station owners were beginning to experience what we might call margin compression from both directions simultaneously. From above, the major oil companies were using their integrated refinery profits to undercut prices and absorb losses at the retail level that an independent operator simply couldn't afford. From below, the convenience store business was evolving in a way that made it harder for small operators to compete on the one thing that had always differentiated them: service. The rise of the self-service convenience store model, pioneered most aggressively by chains like Circle K and 7-Eleven, meant that customers were no longer expecting the personalized service that had once justified higher prices at the independent station. You no longer needed someone to pump your gas for you. You didn't need someone to check your oil or wash your windshield. The customer expected to get out of their car, pay at a pump, and leave within 90 seconds. This transformation had a specific economic consequence. The independent station owner's ability to differentiate through service had evaporated. They were now competing purely on price. And competing on price against an operator with integrated refinery margins was a losing proposition. What made this moment especially difficult was timing. The independent station owner in 1988 had typically made their investment decision back in the late 1970s or early 1980s when the economics had seemed viable. They'd financed their equipment, their building, their inventory based on margin assumptions that had been true 5 years earlier. But 5 years is a long time in the petroleum business. The independent operator was now facing a situation where the underlying business model had shifted beneath them, while they remained locked into the financial commitments they'd made on the basis of the old model. Some operators responded by trying to increase their convenience store revenues, the ancillary business that was supposed to supplement the slim fuel margins. They expanded their product selection, stayed open later, added prepared food, but this required additional capital investment and more labor. And it meant competing directly with purpose-built convenience store chains that had economies of scale the independent operators simply couldn't match. The survival strategy for many independent operators became increasingly desperate. Some began to cut corners on maintenance. Some reduced their hours, some tried to squeeze more gallons through the pumps by cutting their prices even lower, accepting that they would simply work harder for less return. And underlying all of this was a demographic reality that nobody wanted to talk about. The people who owned independent gas stations in 1988 were aging. They'd built their businesses in the 1960s and 1970s, when the economics made sense. But by the late 1980s, many of them were in their 50s and 60s, and they were asking themselves a hard question. Is this worth passing down to my children? For most of them, the answer was no. The numbers didn't work. The margins were collapsing. The labor was unrelenting. And the major oil companies, backed by refinery profits and shareholder capital, were clearly winning a game that the independent operator could never win. What happened next was the beginning of a consolidation that would accelerate dramatically through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The independent gas station didn't disappear overnight, but the writing was on the pump, so to speak. The transition happened in stages. First, independent operators began selling their stations to the major oil companies. Sometimes they sold at a loss, just to exit the business. Sometimes they became employed managers of their own former properties, working for the corporation that had bought them out. Second, some independent stations converted to branded affiliate arrangements. They would keep the independent ownership structure but agree to exclusively sell one brand's fuel. In exchange, they'd receive support from the brand, access to better financing, and marketing help. The price they paid was their autonomy. They became a franchise outlet in all but name. And third, the consolidation happened at the owner level. Small independent operators began to merge their stations informally, pooling their buying power, sharing their labor, trying to achieve some of the economies of scale that the majors possessed naturally. But none of these strategies could overcome the fundamental structural advantage that the integrated oil majors possessed. And that advantage was only going to grow more pronounced as we moved into the 1990s. The gas station business was becoming a utility rather than a business. And like all utilities, it would eventually be dominated by the largest operators. By 1990, the independent gas station owner was already a figure from a fading era. Not gone entirely, but diminished in number, reduced in margin, and increasingly aware that the ground beneath them was shifting in ways they couldn't control. The consolidation of the 1980s had prepared the market for something even larger, the complete vertical integration of fuel, convenience retail, and brand loyalty that would define the 1990s and beyond. Shell, Mobil, Exxon, Chevron, these companies didn't just own refineries and distribution networks anymore. They owned the relationship with the consumer. The independent operator had owned it once. In a small way, he knew his customers by name. He knew what they bought, when they bought it, why they trusted him. By 1995, that relationship belonged entirely to the brands. Consider the economics of a typical independent operator's day in 1994. He opened his station at 6 a.m. His daily labor costs, himself, one part-time attendant, ran about $1.50 to $1.80 per day. His rent on the property was typically $2 to $3.00 per month, or roughly $6.05 to $1.00 per day when amortized across the year. His utilities, insurance, and basic maintenance ran another $5.00 per day. That's approximately $3.00 to $3.30 per day in fixed costs before a single gallon of fuel was sold. To break even on fuel alone, before any margin at all, he needed to move about 1.200 to 1.400 gallons per day at the typical wholesale cost of 95 cents per gallon. That was $1.140 to $1.330 in wholesale costs. Add his fixed costs, and he needed $1.440 to $1.660 in daily fuel revenue just to survive at a retail price of $1.15 per gallon, which was typical for 1994. That meant he needed to sell 1.250 to 1.440 gallons just to break even. But here's what actually happened at most independent stations. They sold between 800 and 1.20 gallons per day. Most fell short of that break-even point on fuel revenue alone. This is where the convenience store became not a profit center but a survival tool. By the mid-1990s, the margin on fuel had compressed so severely that nearly every independent operator was losing money on gasoline. They were giving it away essentially to pull people into the store to buy a $2.50 sandwich, a $1.75 coffee, a $3.99 six-pack of cigarettes. The convenience retail was where they made their 30 to 40% margins. Fuel was the traffic driver. The integrated majors understood this perfectly. It was why they invested so heavily in their convenience stores in the 1990s. Speedway, Circle K, Murphy USA. These weren't fuel companies with retail attached. They were retail companies that happened to sell fuel. The independent operator couldn't compete in retail the way a major could. The major had supply chain efficiency, they had brand recognition, they had negotiating power with national suppliers. A small operator was buying a single case of chips at a time from a wholesaler. Shell's distribution network was buying thousands of cases per day and negotiating directly with manufacturers. And then there was the loyalty program issue. In 1995, Shell launched Shell Club, a loyalty card program that gave discounts to repeat customers. Mobil launched Speed Pass. These programs did something economically devastating to the independent operator. They created a switching cost for the consumer. If you bought fuel at a Shell station, you earned points in the Shell Club. That point balance gave you a reason to return to Shell specifically. The switching cost, the effort required to abandon your accumulated points, became real. An independent operator couldn't offer that. His rewards program couldn't accumulate value across multiple stations because he owned one station. His loyalty had no reach. By 1996, Shell Club and similar programs had successfully locked in enough market share that the value of a Shell card became nearly as important as the quality of the fuel itself. And the independent operator watched his customer base erode, not because he sold worse fuel or provided worse service, but because he couldn't offer what the majors could offer: portability, consistency, and accumulated benefit. The financial model that had sustained thousands of independent operators for 60 years was collapsing. Not gradually, structurally. Let's look at what happened to the actual numbers. In 1985, independent operators controlled approximately 38% of the retail gasoline market in the United States. By 1995, that had fallen to 22%. By 2005, it was below 8%. The decline wasn't a wobble, it was a consistent, relentless contraction of market share. And here's what made it irreversible: the consolidation among the remaining independents themselves. Seeing the writing on the wall, smaller operators began to sell their stations to slightly larger operators. These larger operators would aggregate 5, 10, sometimes 20 stations and try to use that scale to negotiate better wholesale prices and build their own small loyalty program, but even a chain of 20 stations couldn't compete with Shell's network of thousands. Some of these aggregators eventually sold out to the majors, others simply hung on, moving into geographic pockets where the majors had no presence, rural areas, small towns, the economic margins, and accepted their role as a minor player in a game they no longer controlled. The owner who found success in this new world was a different type of operator altogether. He was no longer a merchant in the traditional sense. He was a site manager for a loosely organized network. He negotiated as best he could with major wholesalers who held all the leverage. He kept his margins thin and his volume high. He sold as much convenience retail as he could, which often meant he had to carry products that had nothing to do with gasoline: lottery tickets, energy drinks, prepared food, automotive accessories. He ran his station as a convenience store that happened to offer fuel, not the other way around. This shift represented a complete inversion of the original gas station model. In 1920, you came to a gas station to buy gasoline. Anything else was secondary. By 1995, you came to a convenience store, and gasoline was a traffic driver. The economics had flipped. The psychology had flipped. The entire value chain had been reorganized around this new reality. The independents who survived the 1990s were different from the independents of the 1970s. The 1970s independent was a risk-taker. He owned his station outright or mortgaged it, made his own decisions about pricing and supply, and lived by his own margins. The 1990s independent was increasingly a franchisee in everything but name, operating under agreements that dictated his pricing, his product mix, and his hours. He had the risk of ownership but not the freedom. This is the economic mechanism that transformed the gas station from a business into a utility. A utility is characterized by thin margins, high volume, high standardization, and domination by a small number of large operators. By 2000, the American gas station market had become exactly that. The majors controlled the margins. The majors set the standards. The majors decided which stations would thrive and which would close. If you wanted a deeper understanding of how this entire transformation happened, the specific cost structures, the margin compression, the consolidation strategies, and how independent operators actually tried to fight back, I've put together a comprehensive guide that breaks down every aspect of this story, station by station, year by year. You'll find it in the description and in the pinned comment. What happened to the American gas station between 1970 and 2000 wasn't inevitable. It wasn't simply the result of technological change or consumer preference. It was the result of specific economic decisions by specific companies with specific goals. They consolidated their distribution, they integrated retail, they built brand loyalty programs, they negotiated better terms with their independent operators, they accepted lower margins in exchange for higher volume and greater control. Each of these decisions made sense individually. Together, they transformed an entire industry. And the fascinating part is that this same dynamic, consolidation, vertical integration, brand loyalty programs, the slow erosion of true independence, has repeated itself in industry after industry. The bookstore business, the hardware store business, the video rental business, the coffee shop business, each one followed a similar arc: freedom to consolidation, to standardization, to near monopoly. The independent gas station owner of 1978 believed he was in the gasoline business. He was actually in the margin business. And margins are always under attack from larger players who can afford to lose money on price in exchange for market share. By the early 2000s, the independent gas station, as a distinct business model, had essentially ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Independents still operated, certainly, but they operated within systems and constraints they didn't control. They had become nodes in a larger network rather than autonomous businesses. What's worth understanding is that this didn't happen to gas stations because of anything intrinsic to gasoline or fuel distribution. It happened because of the structure of capitalism itself. Scale matters. Vertical integration matters. The ability to absorb short-term losses in exchange for long-term market control matters. The independent operator, no matter how hardworking or capable, cannot match these advantages. The gas station business is a lesson in how an entire industry can be reorganized not through failure or incompetence, but through the methodical application of structural economic advantages. Thank you for watching this deep dive into how gas stations stopped making money, and how that process revealed so much about the machinery of American business itself. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand these stories in their full complexity, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video from the Ledger of Lost America.